Imagine finding yourself in the middle of a bustling market, surrounded by the sound of laughter, all of it aimed at you. That was the very moment Mariana experienced that day. She had just spent a considerable sum and paid a high price for an elderly man whom nobody else wanted. A slave with a white beard, a back that was slightly bent, and hands that bore the marks of decades of toil in every single line and wrinkle. The crowd made absolutely no attempt to conceal their amusement. She bought scrap, thinking it was gold. She caught those words. She caught every single one of them. Yet she continued on her way, because she had noticed something in that old man's eyes. A quality that money could never purchase. A quality that the jeers of an entire community could never diminish. Only at that point, she had no clue just how accurate her instinct was, and just how mistaken everyone else truly was. The odor reached her before the visual did, not the scent of a thriving farm. It was the odor of abandonment, of soil that had remained untrodden for a long while, of neglect that had permeated the very atmosphere. As Mariana entered through the gate, the ox cart continued to groan behind her. The sound of parched wood scraping against aged iron. Her gaze moved unhurriedly across the landscape. Yellowed grass with broken tips, open ditches resembling open injuries, skinny cattle wandering without direction, like spirits without a home. Each fallen log, each broken fence seemed to communicate the same sentiment. No one cared. No one desired this place, and now all of it belonged to her, the widow who was still learning the contours of her own sorrow. Further on, near the animal enclosures, some of the enslaved individuals worked with heavy, deliberate movements. The way people work when they've come to understand that hope only brings pain. As they watched Mariana descend from the cart, suspicious glances were cast her way, not with hope, but out of routine. A new mistress, a new destiny. The same old dangers. That was when Benedito stepped forward, moving unhurriedly, with that dignity, and yes, that is precisely the appropriate term, that dignity which even years of chains had been unable to shatter. He uttered nothing. He simply surveyed the farm with the gaze of someone who recognizes an ailing body and already understands where it aches. On the opposite side, the overseers waited with stern expressions. Men who had become more accustomed to issuing commands than the owners themselves. When Mariana spoke of reorganizing the fields, of treating the enslaved with dignity, she overheard muffled snickers, murmurs from the corners of mouths. Mockery disguised as counsel. Too gentle, too inexperienced, too naive. And then the most painful remark of all, a woman alone cannot manage a harvest or endure a storm. Nobody concealed their discomfort at seeing Benedito beside her. They regarded him with that calculated disdain of individuals who have already formed their opinions before observing anything. The sunken belly, the white beard, they viewed these as evidence of worthlessness. But Benedito merely observed, with that composure that comes from someone who has witnessed everything collapse before and knows the art of rebuilding with patience. Later, Mariana walked through the main house by herself. The floorboards moaned with every step. The kitchen stood empty, windows left open for dust to drift through, walls shedding layers of neglect. In every corner, an unsettled debt. An unfinished narrative. She inhaled deeply, felt the burden of everything she had inherited. And for a brief moment, she appeared far too small to bear it all. But when she returned to the yard, she discovered Benedito standing at the edge of the dry well, staring down into its depths. Not with grief, but with acknowledgement. The way someone looks when they perceive a buried promise where others merely see a hollow void. In that instant, without a single word exchanged between them, something commenced. The young mistress everyone considered fragile, The elderly slave everyone dismissed as worthless. The overseers chuckled in the background. Let them laugh. Because while they were laughing, the land was already paying attention. The following morning arrived softly, as if the farm itself were anticipating the first move to comprehend who was now in command. Mariana ventured out early, still carrying the scent of mildew in her garments, and discovered Benedito seated in the shade of an ingazira tree, calmly honing the blade of an old hoe. The sun hadn't yet gained enough intensity to scorch, but it caught the old man's white beard, each strand carrying a glint that resembled time's own signature. He lifted his eyes slowly, without haste. He inclined his head in a gesture of respect, a simple motion that carried more dignity than many free men ever managed to exhibit. Mariana inquired about his name. Benedito drew a deep breath before responding. His voice emerged firm, without a quiver. The voice of a man who had cultivated many lands, obeyed numerous masters, but had never permitted anyone to steal his soul. Benedito, mistress. In that simple, Benedito, mistress, he offered an entire history, one he was in no rush to tell. The old man requested only what an exhausted man asks when he still retains his honor: clean water, a patch of ground to hang his hammock, and the right to work. He didn't ask for favors, didn't seek protection, only labor. Mariana listened with a constriction in her chest, because rarely in life do we encounter someone who asks for so little with such grandeur. She led him to a storage shed at the back of the main house. He examined the space meticulously, measuring the timber, evaluating whether it would support a hammock, tools, stillness. Then he moved toward the storehouse, and Mariana hesitated. She knew the overseer would disapprove, that the administrators would whisper. But there was something about that old man that dispelled doubt. Benedito wasn't requesting a favor. He was requesting responsibility, and responsibility is not something you entrust impulsively. When the keys touched his palm, the clink was faint, but everyone in the yard heard it. There were glances, whispers, crooked smiles. The workers were disturbed to see an elderly enslaved man receive that level of trust. The administrators frowned. Benedito remained motionless, steady, holding the keys the way someone holds a sacred commitment. He didn't need to utter a word. His silence already signaled that something there was shifting, even if nobody yet knew where it was headed. The rumor spread before the sun reached its zenith. It only took someone spotting Benedito with the storehouse keys for the news to travel to João Grande. The overseer, a tall man with a heavy voice and footsteps that made the wooden porch tremble. He carried in his eyes a mixture of suspicion and wounded pride, the kind common in men who have grown used to issuing orders without being challenged. When he learned that the young mistress had entrusted the keys to the old man everyone called useless, his face hardened like stone. He found Benedito in the yard sorting seeds with the patience of someone who understands the rhythm of the earth. He approached slowly, not out of respect, but as a threat. He wanted the old man to sense his presence before any words were exchanged. He asked in a drawn-out tone, who had granted him the authority to touch the storehouse. Benedito raised his eyes just enough to acknowledge who stood before him. No defiance, no submission, just the quiet steadiness of someone who has no intention of contending for power. The mistress gave me the keys, and he returned to his task. Those words landed on the ground like a provocation. João Grande stepped nearer and labeled the old man useless, dead weight, a burden. He asserted that the storehouse was no place for someone his age, that the farm had no tolerance for aged, worn-out things. The words came sharp, honed like a blade, anticipating Benedito's collapse from within. But the old man breathed deeply, wiped the sweat from his brow, and murmured softly, like someone releasing a truth to the wind that he'd known for a long, long time. Those who plant respect harvest peace. That statement irritated the overseer more than any direct confrontation could have, because Benedito was above it. Above the provocation, above the animosity being directed at him. Jonao Grande was accustomed to watching men tremble. He didn't know what to do with serenity, and so he went to speak with Mariana, went to find her, went to talk. He spoke about discipline, about tradition, about how certain things must remain unchanged. His voice carried concern as a disguise. But the real fear was losing the control he had always possessed. Mariana listened in silence, and the overseer observed that his words no longer found the same footing as before. As the afternoon descended, Benedito gathered his tools and walked toward the shed. He passed near the overseer without averting his gaze. There was no challenge in it, only presence. Jonao Grande stood still, watching that thin, aged figure disappear at the far end of the yard. And he stood there, the way someone stands when they're no longer certain the ground beneath their feet is solid. It wasn't anger he was feeling. It was that thing we don't like to admit. It was fear. Because there are people who never need to raise their voice. Their presence is already the message. The sun had barely broken the horizon when Mariana found Benedito walking between the dry garden beds, pressing the tips of his fingers into the earth. Like someone waking a sleeping body, every gesture of his carried memory, a knowledge that came from before any fence or deed of title. She observed how he tilted his face toward the wind as if interpreting the scent of rain that hadn't yet announced itself. It was in that silence that she found herself seeking his opinion. Not out of a shortage of options, because there was something in that old man that inspired trust before any explanation was needed. When she asked about the planting, Benedito breathed deeply and explained, that land was exhausted. Not from lack of rain, from lack of care. There was a right time to plant, a time to let the earth breathe, and another time to harvest without violence. He spoke slowly, in simple words, without imposing, only sharing what he knew. Mariana listened the way you listen to a childhood story. And for the first time since she'd arrived at the farm, she felt that perhaps she wasn't fighting alone against all of it. Benedito wasn't just showing her what to do. He was showing her how to perceive the world at a different rhythm. One morning, he showed her a simple remedy for wounds using plants growing forgotten beside the stream. An old formula passed hand to hand by people who had no books, but had memory. Mariana watched the gentle way he ground the leaves, how he held the small jars, the strong green smell of crushed leaves, the care he poured into every step. That man the entire village had called useless carried an arsenal of knowledge that seemed to belong to a more just time. She began to understand. Wisdom does not wear the clothes of youth. It wears the scar of experience. One afternoon, as they watched the enslaved working, Benedito spoke about respect. Not as kindness as a tool of survival for everyone. A wounded land produces less, and so does a man who has been humiliated. Mariana felt that sentence sink in. There was too much truth there to ignore. It was then that Benedito revealed, in a short conversation at dusk, that he had once been an overseer at another farm, that he had carried out his work with fairness until he was sold out of envy and false rumors. Mariana didn't ask for details, but she noticed in his eyes an old shadow, something that still hurt. But that did not define him. He spoke like someone who had watched everything collapse before and knew how to rebuild with patience. The days began to change. The crops, once scorched, responded with small signs of life. The enslaved worked with a different energy. Not for reward, but because the old man's presence brought an order that didn't crush. And Mariana, her face still marked by grief, began to walk the farm with a new steadiness. The faith she had nearly lost inside herself began to stir awake. Not in grand gestures, in the quiet constancy of each new morning. Because some transformations make no sound. They simply bloom. The news reached the mouths of the village before the morning dew had dried. The young widow, crushed under the farm's debts, was taking counsel from an old slave. The story moved door to door like market gossip, and before long, the mockery was everywhere. They said she had lost her mind, that grief had taken her sense, that it was only a matter of time before the farm crumbled entirely. They called Benedito dead weight, a useless shadow, a living reminder of what no one wants to become when old age arrives. Dead weight, shadow, reminder. From the top of a nearby hill, some villagers pointed at the farm and laughed. They said that piece of land would turn to dust. But Mariana, hearing the comments carried on the wind, only pressed her lips together and kept working. She didn't answer. She didn't confront. She learned, slowly, that there are battles that are not won with words. They are won with fruit. And Benedito, always at her side, kept that posture of serenity that no one could bend. When someone told him about the villagers' jokes, he only smiled from the corner of his mouth and said, in a tone that seemed to come from another time altogether, "Those who plant in silence harvest in silence. The noise belongs to those without roots." The village laughed without knowing that laughter sometimes is the beginning of a fall. Because while they mocked the widow and the old man, the land they despised was beginning to wake up. And then the drought arrived. Without asking permission, without warning, without mercy. The sky turned to metal, the earth turned to dust, and the water simply vanished. In the village, men walked with their heads down, their hands dirty with useless earth. Women stared at the horizon searching for a cloud that never came. The dust clung to skin, to throats, to eyes. The heat was the kind that exhausts you before noon. Mariana's farm, already fragile, seemed on the edge of the same fate. The cattle groaned with thirst. The crops that had survived began to buckle. But there was something different there, something that didn't buckle under despair. It was Benedito who pointed to the spot, a patch of ground that no one paid attention to. Ordinary ground, not a sign of anything visible. The land is speaking here, mistress, right here. Mariana didn't understand, but she trusted. The workers dug for hours under a sun that burned without pity. The sound of hoes striking dry ground. Blow, blow, blow. The vibration traveling up the arm, wearing out the shoulders before the hands. Many doubted. Some muttered quiet mockery. And even Mariana began to fear she had asked too much of the old man. But Benedito stayed there, sitting in the small shade of a cashew tree, watching everything with that calm that seemed not to belong to the world around him. With each blow of the hoe, his gaze held steady, like someone who already knew. When the water came, it didn't surge up in a rush. It emerged timidly, like a child opening its eyes after a long, long sleep. But it was clean, cool, alive. The men shouted out of relief, you know. The way people shout when the body can't hold it in any longer. The women wept quietly, and even the cattle, catching the scent of cool moisture, came forward with urgency. Mariana knelt beside the spring, let the water run between her fingers. Cold. Real. Benedito stood just behind her and said softly, "The land speaks, mistress, but only those who bow their heads can hear." While neighboring farms withered, that small patch of earth held firm. Every full bucket was a silent reminder that faith, when born from listening and from humility, can transform even the driest ground. The night fell heavy with a silence that promised no rest. The moon, thin as a blade, seemed to watch everything with suspicion. João Grande, moved through the shadows with the stride of a man who has already made up his mind. Benedito's well had eaten away what was left of the overseer's pride. Every bucket of water drawn from it felt like it was pulling away another piece of the control he had always held. He watched Mariana draw closer to the old man. He watched the enslaved follow his guidance, and that consumed him like a fire kept hidden. When he arrived at the crops, he was carrying an ember inside an old tin can. His hand trembled from rage, not from fear. One breath was all it took. The flame came to life. It scattered sparks across the dry leaves. The fire ran fast, as though it had been waiting for exactly that moment. Within minutes, the crops became a blaze that lit up the sky. The overseer stepped back, feigning shock. He was already preparing his speech. The blame, he had decided, would fall on Benedito. But fate moves at its own pace. The old man was seen running toward the flames with a bucket of water in his thin hands. Eyes burning not with fear, with urgency. He fought the fire the way someone fights for something that has already become part of their own soul. His white beard lit by the flames. His body pressing forward without stopping to calculate the risk. When the first workers arrived, they found Benedito coughing, his face covered in soot, trying to save whatever he could. That was when the shouting began. The old man is behind this. He's trying to finish off what's left. Chaos swept through the yard. Mariana came out of the main house, still in her sleeping clothes. The glow of the flames reflected in her eyes. When she saw Benedito hunched over, leaning on the bucket, she felt her heart tighten. But doubt weighed on her too. Days of accumulated tension, the overseer's voice on one side, echoing through the night, the humble figure of the old man on the other, barely able to breathe. She approached slowly, very slowly, and looked at the old man. He raised his smoke, darkened face, red eyes, and held Mariana's gaze without fear. There was a silent trust in that look, almost painful, saying more than any rushed explanation ever could. The overseer pressed forward with greater force, crying betrayal, destruction, manipulation. The words came fast, the way they come from someone afraid that silence will expose the lie. Mariana raised her hand, called for quiet, and her voice, steady, cut through the tension. Before any punishment, I want to hear what he has to say. João Grande tried to interrupt. She didn't allow it. She walked to Benedito and said only, "Speak." The old man breathed deeply, the smoke still cutting through his chest, and he met Mariana's eyes with the serenity that never left them. "If I wanted fire, mistress, I wouldn't have brought a bucket of water." One sentence. But it fell into the yard like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples that reached even the hardest eyes. The overseer tried to react. He raised his voice, but something in him faltered, and in that faltering, one worker looked at him with suspicion, then another, then another. The lie, held up by pride, was beginning to crack. The next morning, João Grande appeared with a gaunt face and rounded shoulders. He looked smaller, the way a person looks when they finally carry the full weight of their own choices. He walked to Mariana, without looking sideways, and confessed in a low voice, almost a whisper, that it had been him who set the fire. That envy had consumed him, that he couldn't bear watching Benedito earn his place. When he finished, the silence that followed was one of closure, not of judgment. Mariana didn't order a whipping. She didn't humiliate. She simply ordered, in a firm voice, that he leave the farm immediately. Not out of revenge, because his presence no longer had a place in the new cycle that was taking shape. The overseer left without looking back, carrying with him a shame that no whip could have relieved. When the dust of his footsteps settled, every eye turned to Benedito. Mariana walked to him. She took his smoke-marked hand and said only, "The truth doesn't need to run. It arrives at the right time. The old man bowed his head. That day, the farm understood that strength does not live in whoever shouts the loudest. It lives in whoever remains whole when the world tries to break them. The first rains came timidly, almost embarrassed by how long they'd been away. They fell lightly, wetting the earth with care, like hands waking someone who has suffered too much. The smell of damp soil spread through the air, mingled with the sound of drops touching leaves that seemed to be coming back to life. A music no one rehearsed, but that everyone recognized. It was a sign of a new beginning. Benedito walked through the yard with slow steps, like someone keeping pace with the rhythm of their own faith. Mariana watched the fields with different eyes. She saw seedlings rising from the soil, each one defying the suffering the drought had left behind. Each stem that pushed upward seemed to say, "This farm still has a future." It was during this time that Benedito reorganized the work without imposing authority. He gathered the enslaved at the start of each day, distributed the tasks with a fairness no one was accustomed to receiving. There was no raised voice, no humiliation. There was order. There was purpose. The men and women who had worked before only to survive began to feel, for the first time, that their hands were building something that would not be torn away at the next sunrise. One afternoon, Mariana watched him guiding young workers who were trying to straighten a fallen fence. He crouched down. He showed them with his own hands. He explained the alignment, and beyond that, he showed patience, real patience, the kind that neither humiliates nor rushes. And the young ones followed him out of trust. The crops found their color again. The trees put out new leaves. The cattle grew strong. Life began to flow through every corner of the land again, like water finding its way out of hard stone. At the center of all of it, Benedito, walking with his hands behind his back, watching every detail, seeking no credit, only making sure everything happened at the right time. The harvest that year was not the largest in the farm's history, but it was the most meaningful. Every bundle gathered carried the mark of a transformation that no one could deny any longer. And when Mariana lifted the first sack of grain, feeling its golden weight between her fingers, she understood something she had been trying to grasp from the very beginning. Some harvests don't come from rain. They come from the soul. The late afternoon settled slowly over the farm, a copper-toned light that seemed to want to rest on every rooftop, every trunk, every breath. Mariana walked along the veranda of the main house with calm steps. The farm was finding its rhythm, and she was beginning to find hers. That was when she heard Benedito's low voice calling, without urgency, with that gentle reverence he had always kept. The old man was seated on a simple bench, his hands resting in his lap, his gaze deeper than usual. The way someone looks when they've been carrying something that hasn't yet found the right moment to be given. Mariana approached slowly. She sensed that the silence around them had a different quality. Benedito opened his hand slowly. He revealed a silver medallion, worn by decades, but still catching the light where it touched. He held it for a moment, like someone revisiting a memory before letting it go. And then he began to speak. He told her that many years ago, he had served a man of great character, a master unlike the others, someone from whom he learned not only a trade, but what it meant to be human. That man was Mariana's father. He told her how he had accompanied him on journeys, how he had once saved his life during a nighttime ambush, and how, in quiet gratitude, her father had given him that medallion, a symbol of trust, not of wealth. Benedito had never boasted of it. He kept it the way someone keeps a promise that hasn't yet found the person it belongs to. Mariana listened with her heart in her throat. She had never imagined that the old man she had bought beneath the villagers. Ridicule was someone who carried a piece of her own story. When Benedito said he had recognized her name on the day of the purchase and had stayed silent, out of respect, out of something like destiny, Mariana felt something break and rebuild inside her at the same time. It was as though a circle she hadn't even known existed was finally closing. The old man held out the medallion with trembling hands. It was not a farewell. It was a return. Take it, mistress. It is a memory from someone who loved you before the world had learned to call you a woman. She held the medallion, felt the cold of the metal meet the warmth of her palm. The tears that came were not from sadness. They were from recognition. Mariana saw in Benedito not only the man who had helped save the farm, not only the old man the village had rejected, but the silent guardian of a forgotten piece of her own history. The wind blew stronger, rustling the mango tree leaves, and Mariana closed the medallion in her hands. God gave back what I didn't even know I had lost. Because some encounters don't begin on the day people first meet. They begin on the day their destinies recognize each other. The following year arrived with a slower pace, as if life itself wanted to move in step with Benedito. The old man, who had once crossed the farm with firm strides, began to tire more easily. His breathing grew short. The hands, always so precise in handling the earth, trembled for the first time. Mariana noticed before a single word was spoken. She began visiting him every morning. She brought warm broth. She listened to his stories, adjusted his hammock. And when the illness confined him to the shed he called home, she drew close, the way a daughter does when she refuses to abandon. At night she sat beside the hammock listening to the uneven sound of his breathing. The wind in the early hours drifting through the open door, the silence between one breath and the next growing longer and longer. There was no medicine. There was no luxury. There was care, and Benedito, every time he opened his eyes, smiled with that calm that never left him. Like someone who accepts the end without fear, knowing that his journey had been fulfilled. One night, with the moon lighting the yard, he asked to speak with Mariana alone. His voice came out as a whisper, but steady, always steady. He didn't ask for riches, didn't ask for tribute. He asked only for the right to rest beneath the great tree beside the well he had helped to dig. God left living water there, and it is there that my body shall rest, because the earth knows where to place its children. Mariana held back the tears as best she could. On the day of his death, the sky woke heavy, but not sad. A warm wind swept through the farm before the workers had risen, as if announcing that something sacred was about to happen. Benedito left in silence, without visible pain, with the serene expression of someone returning home after a long journey. Mariana closed his eyes with a trembling hand. She prayed quietly, giving thanks for having been guided. As they stepped out of the shed, a dark cloud moved over the sun, and the rain began to fall, slowly, gently, like hands offering a blessing. The enslaved stopped where they stood. They lifted their faces to feel the water that hadn't come in weeks. Mariana understood immediately. It wasn't just rain. It was a farewell. They buried Benedito beneath the great tree. The earth, freshened by the rain, received the old man's body with the same softness with which it had received his seeds. Some workers prayed quietly. Others laid flowers gathered in haste. There was no solitary grief in that act. There was recognition. The rain continued. The farm prospered in a way no one had ever witnessed. The greatest harvest in the entire region. And the village, the same village that had laughed, came to see. Some of them, standing before the well, murmured almost with shame. The old man she brought. He brought the blessing with him, who at night, when everything grew still, Some swore they could hear an ancient prayer rising from the edges of the well. A low rhythmic murmur. That sounded like the way Benedito used to speak with the earth. Mariana listened once late at night, sitting on the veranda without fear, without surprise. She knew it wasn't a ghost. It was memory. Some people pass through the world and leave no mark. And some people stay. Even after they're gone, Benedito stayed.